Pope Francis has taken a very different tone toward LGBT Catholics than previous popes have. From his famous comment, "Who am I to judge?" about gay priests, to his close public friendship with a gay man and his outspoken support of legal protections for same-sex couples, Pope Francis has decisively shifted the Church's public tone away from condemnation and towards, in the words of the Catechism, respect, compassion, and sensitivity. So let's take a look at how the Vatican's approach to LGBT Catholics has evolved over the last 50 years. Then we'll explore Pope Francis's most important words and actions for the LGBT community with Father James Martin. So, what makes Pope Francis's approach to LGBT issues different from past popes? In the past, a lot of emphasis was placed on doctrine and condemnation. Popes and other Catholics prioritize teaching that, quote, homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered, and that a, quote, homosexual inclination, while not inherently sinful, is, quote, objectively disordered. Francis's immediate predecessors, Benedict XVI and John Paul II, felt strongly that asserting this aspect of the Church's moral teaching was an effective and honest way to be respectful and compassionate. And that emphasis wasn't just abstract, it informed the Pope's actions. After Vatican II, conversations and theological arguments about homosexuality became more common. And that sparked a pushback from the Vatican, which responded by emphasizing doctrine. Under John Paul II, the Vatican's Doctrine Office cracked down on theologians like Philip Keane and Charlie Curran, who argued that there were some instances, like within committed same-sex relationships, where sex between two men or two women could be seen as morally acceptable, or at least not, quote, absolutely immoral. In Father Keane's case, the imprimatur, or the church approval, was removed from his book. In Curran's case, which involved him disagreeing with church doctrine on a number of issues, he was fired from the Catholic University of America. The Vatican also cracked down on people who were ministering pastorally to LGBT people, like Sister Janine Gramick, Father Robert Nugent, and Father John McNeil, because the Vatican was concerned that they weren't placing enough emphasis on doctrine. Even the US bishops were corrected by the Vatican's Doctrine Office while they were preparing a pastoral letter for parents of gay children. Cardinal Ratzinger, who was head of the Vatican's Doctrine Office at the time, had the bishops remove a paragraph encouraging priests to use the words gay and lesbian when struggle with same-sex attraction was the church-approved line, and he added a footnote describing homosexuality as objectively disordered. As the head of the Vatican's Doctrine Office, it makes sense that Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, would emphasize this part of the Catechism's teaching. But at times, that seemed to come at the expense of the very next line of Catholic teaching on the matter, that gay and lesbian people, quote, must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. In 1992, Cardinal Ratzinger would send a letter to the US bishops supporting legal discrimination against same-sex couples in certain areas, including banning same-sex couples from adopting children, refusing to hire them as teachers and coaches, and banning them from serving in the military, a ban that remained in place in the US until 2011. Benedict and John Paul II saw gay marriage as a policy that would undermine the family structure based on a marriage between a man and a woman. For this reason, they would often speak of gay marriage in the same way that they spoke about other cultural evils like abortion, things that Benedict said in 2012 threatened the future of humanity itself. Although Pope Francis hasn't changed church teaching on marriage or approved of sex between gay couples, it's still easy to see how Pope Francis's more pastoral emphasis on respect, compassion, and sensitivity has marked a big shift in the Church's approach to LGBT people. In the rest of this video, we'll talk with Father James Martin about 5 big signs of that change, beginning with Pope Francis's famous words aboard the papal plane in 2013, quote, "If a person is gay and seeks God and has goodwill, who am I to judge?"
It was a real change in tone. I think those were his 5 most famous words of his pontificate, and they were directed first towards the question about a gay priest. What happens if you have a priest who's gay? And he said, if someone is following God in goodwill, I'm paraphrasing, who am I to judge? The next day someone said, did you mean that just about gay priests? He said, no, about all homosexuals. That's the word he usually uses. And it was a dramatic shift in tone from previous popes who usually used much more, I would say, condemnatory and accusatory language about LGBT people. And I think that was the beginning of the opening of the door in his pontificate.
And how did people react to it?
They were delighted. I think a lot of people say, oh, he's not changed any teaching, which he's not. But he's really changed the conversation, and one of the ways to see that and to see the results is to talk to LGBTQ people and see what their reactions are. And many of them felt really welcomed, and they sensed a shift in tone themselves.
3 years after Who Am I to Judge, Pope Francis wrote Amoris Laetitia, The Joy of Love, a major apostolic exhortation on marriage and the family. And in it, he made very explicit that he wanted to prioritize caring for gay people pastorally. He wrote, quote, "We would like before all else to reaffirm that every person, regardless of sexual orientation, ought to be respected in his or her dignity and treated with consideration, while every sign of unjust discrimination is to be carefully avoided, particularly any form of aggression and violence."
Unlike many other documents in the Church which condemn LGBT people and talk about them almost exclusively in the language of sin, Amoris Laetitia said, before all else, we have to recognize their human dignity and treat them with respect. That's a big shift in tone as well. And I love that before all else, which, you know, in the West might not seem to be a big deal. People might think, oh, you know, so what? You know, they have human dignity. But in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, you know, to be told before all else we need to recognize the inherent dignity of the LGBTQ person, where that's often not done, is a big step forward.
Now, this might all seem a little abstract. The Pope is saying a lot of nice things about gay people, but does he actually do the kind of pastoral ministry and accompaniment of gay people that he's been advocating as Pope? The answer seems to be yes.
Pope Francis has been friends with LGBTQ people since his time in Buenos Aires as Archbishop. When he was here in the United States in 2015, he met with Yayo Grassi, who's a gay man who was one of his students and Yayo Grassi's same-sex partner, and that was done very publicly. Recently, he's developed a friendship with, as you say, Juan Carlos Cruz, who I know is a wonderful person. Juan Carlos had been a victim of abuse in Chile, and initially Pope Francis had kind of pushed back against some of the things Juan Carlos said, but that honesty led to this really deep relationship. And they see each other frequently, and he recently appointed Juan Carlos to a high-level papal commission on sex abuse. And so that would have been unthinkable 10 or 15 years ago, that an openly gay man would be publicly appointed to this very high-level commission is extraordinary.
Father Martin spoke earlier about how what seems like a tepid support for LGBT people can come off as very progressive in more conservative countries, where LGBT people might have fewer legal rights. One example of this is the Pope's support for civil union protections for same-sex couples.
It's a big step forward. I mean, he's kind of carved out a space for himself, which is that he does not accept the possibility of a sacramental marriage, you know, for a same-sex couple within the Church, but he supports, and he has said this ever since he's been in Buenos Aires, protections, legal protections for civil unions. And you're right, Colleen, I mean, in 70 countries, it's illegal to be LGBTQ, it's illegal to engage in same-sex activities. So for him to even say anything positive about civil unions is a big step forward.
The last example of a gesture that the Pope has made to change the Church's tone on LGBT issues is his meeting with Father Martin in 2019. At that point, Father Martin had been focusing his ministry on LGBT people, and he had released 2 editions of his book, Building a Bridge. And even though he didn't advocate for a change in church teaching, he had faced quite a bit of criticism from people who thought he wasn't emphasizing doctrine enough. So it was a big deal when the Pope invited him for a highly publicized visit.
I was delighted, of course. It was a highlight of my life. And they put it on the Pope's official schedule. But something I can say now, because he subsequently wrote me a letter in support, was that the meeting was extremely positive. We talked about LGBTQ things. And at the end of the meeting, I've never really shared this before, I said, is there anything I can do for you? You know, because we were talking about LGBT stuff, and I thought, you know, maybe he wants to talk about something else. And he said, yes, you can continue your ministry in peace. And I thought, all right, you've just gotten a mission, which is something that really encourages me. But that meeting, I think, was one of many public signs that he has done as a way of teaching and as a way of showing his support, not only for LGBTQ people, but for those who minister to them in the Catholic Church.
I asked Father Martin what we can tell about the Pope's approach to LGBT issues when we look at all of these gestures together. If you were to summarize what the movement that all of these little gestures come together to paint is, how would you describe it?
That's a great question. I would say openness. So rather than get away from us, it's come towards us. Again, his culture of encounter is really important. It's meeting people as they are, for who they are, in their sexuality and their gender identity and being open to them and listening to them, which is what Jesus did. And, you know, if we're not trying to be like Jesus, what's the point?
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting that red button. And to access all of our print, audio, and video content and support our work, please consider purchasing a digital subscription to America Magazine. You can do that at americamagazine.org/subscribe and find a link in the description below.